back in 1889, when John Philip Sousa had written and published his very famous march, The Washington Post, which is what you're listening to right now, one of the world's largest tubas was built. We've known it for decades as the Harvard tuba, but it went by a very different name when it was born. And this is the amazing story of this massive instrument. My name is Dave Detweiler. I've had the opportunity to research and write about this historic horn. For the details and the proper footnoting, you can go to the ITEA Journal, the fall 2019 edition, which is volume 47, number 1. But this is a story that needs to get out there. People need to know the history behind this fascinating instrument. And so I'm going to read for you my article and show you some images, all of which I have permission to share. So enjoy jumping back to 1889 and learning about one of the greatest tubas the world has ever known. Here we go. Prodigious. According to Merriam-Webster, this adjective is defined as causing amazement or wonder, extraordinary in bulk, quantity, or degree, enormous. If you were to build the world's largest tuba, this is exactly the kind of word that you would expect to hear in connection with such a ridiculously oversized bass horn. As it turns out, the massive instrument that we now know as the Harvard tuba, when it first went public in 1889, was thoughtfully dubbed La Prodigieuse, which is French for the prodigious one. Here is the story behind this amazing instrument. Early inspiration from sax? At the Great Exhibition of 1851, held in London, the Paris-based inventor Adolphe Sax displayed 85 of his instruments, one of which was a kind of monster ophicleide called the Saxhorn Bourdon, about 10 feet high. Yes, you heard that right, 10 feet high. As far as we know, this 52-foot E-flat instrument was the first subcontrabass tuba the world had ever seen. In 1877, when Sax was apparently selling this giant in Paris, one report called the horn a prodigious affair. There's our word. Further clarifying that its roar, when sounded, fully justifies the name of Bourdon, which term designates the great deep-toned booming big bell of cathedrals. In 1855, at the Exposition Universelle in Paris, Sax once again exhibited a subcontrabass Saxhorn Bourdon, although this time in 26-foot E-flat, and looking much more like a typical tuba, stretching to a slightly less impressive height of around 6 feet. 12 years later, at the Exposition Universelle of 1867, Sax seems to have featured his 52-foot E-flat monster yet again, as well as a massive sax tuba, a helicon-like horn that rests on the right shoulder. Now, what do these giant bass instruments built by Sax have to do with La Prodigieuse? Possibly nothing. But Gustave Besson opened his instrument shop in Paris in 1838, created a London branch in time for the Great Exhibition of 1851, got into legal disputes with Sax over the next 10 years, and proudly displayed his instruments at the Paris Expositions of 1855 and 1867. By the time La Prodigieuse was built by Besson in 1889, one of Gustave's daughters, Martha, was running the firm. She would have been an impressionable 15 years old when her father won a gold medal at the 1867 exposition and when Sax displayed his most recent giant tubas. It does make you wonder. The Eiffel Tower of Tubas. In 1880, about 5 years after the death of her parents, Martha Besson married Adolphe Fontaine and promptly changed the company name to Fontaine Besson, or simply F. Besson. The couple, with Martha leading the way, ran both the original Paris factory and the London factory. The latter had been built in 1858 and was expanded to include an impressive new factory building in 1888 and new offices the following year. In other words, business was booming, And as the Exposition Universelle of 1889 approached, they got the company heavily involved. F. Besson and Company had 4 unique exhibits spread around the exposition in Paris. The first 2 both won gold medals, one featuring their instruments for civilian bands and the other their instruments for military bands. The third showcased a collection of ancient instruments, but the fourth, it won a special medal for being truly, well, prodigious. Here's how the British Bandsman described it. In the Économie Sociale Cercle Populaire, a section organized by the press, the Bessons were asked to display a trophy, and the production is an immense attraction. In the center of a space 32 feet high and 16 feet wide, draped most richly from top to bottom in art, blue, red, and gold, stands a pedestal on which is a huge instrument which is labeled La Prodigieuse. This instrument is 14 feet high, bell upwards, and spurting, as it were, out of this enormous bell is a complete series of brass instruments which have the appearance of floating in midair. Attached to the bend of the monster is a tiny little pocket soprano labeled Minimus. At the foot of the pedestal are arranged 2 trophies of 10 drums, and the whole is so artistically arranged and so novel that we advise all our readers who visit the exhibition not to fail to go and see La Prodigieuse and Minimus. End of quote. I'm sure it wasn't lost on the Fontaine-Bessons that this was the exposition that would feature the Eiffel Tower, which had been rising majestically above the fairgrounds for 2 years. Why not create a similarly glorious musical spectacle, topped off by the world's largest tuba? The June 14, 1889 edition of Le Petit Journal made this connection when it observed that Besson's giant trophy in the press pavilion was, and I quote, like an Eiffel Tower, a gigantic bombardon from the bell of which spurts out the whole family of brass prototype instruments, unquote. Among those captivated by this Eiffel Tower of tubas was Carl Fischer of New York City. Since 1883, Fischer had been the sole agent in the U.S. for instruments built by F. Besson and Company, and he spent the summer of 1889 visiting the factories in both London and Paris, and then took in the exposition. There he was dazzled by what Besson had on display and proceeded to purchase all the English model Besson instruments on exhibition. This included La Prodigieuse. Just how much Fischer had to fork out for the giant tuba was not reported, but the November 1889 edition of the Metronome did confirm that it was, quote, constructed by F. Besson and Company of London, and more significantly called it a novel instrument commended to P.S. Gilmore's attention, unquote. The article, though, continued. We understand that Mr. Carl Fischer has made arrangements to have it shipped to New York immediately, subsequent to the closing of the Paris Exposition, November 6th. This will afford an opportunity for the man with the proverbial, quote, lungs of a horse to display his powers, supposing the modesty of the man does not intervene. Here is a grand chance for P.S. Gilmore to add the biggest bass on earth to the best band in the world, and thus possess the largest wind instrument in the universe, unquote. It is at this point that we can debunk one of the most often repeated claims about the history of the Harvard tuba, that it was built for John Philip Sousa. In 1889, Sousa's band was still 3 years away from being formed, whereas Gilmore was enjoying tremendous success leading the world's greatest band for its 17th year. Fischer knew exactly which door to knock on to promote his prized possession, but we're getting ahead of ourselves now. Arriving in New York City. This is probably as good a place as any to reveal that La Prodigieuse is actually 6 feet 11 inches tall, weighs 88 pounds, and has a bell diameter of 31.5 inches. Shipping such a monstrous triple B-flat bass from Paris to New York in late 1889 must have presented quite a challenge, particularly if you wanted to minimize dents. But thankfully, it arrived safely in its new home, as reported in the February 1890 edition of the Metronome, in a delightful article titled, "Not a Fake." It's worth quoting almost in full. Here's what it says. "No, it is not a fake, but a genuine and most perfectly constructed musical instrument." These words fell from the lips of Mr. Carl Fisher the other day in reply to a question put by a custom house official, who remarked with every appearance of doubt, "Well, if it be not a fake, it is the most marvelous-looking brass instrument I ever clapped eyes on." The instrument thus described was none other than the monster bass manufactured by F. Besson and Company and exhibited by them at the Paris Exposition. It has fittingly been named La Prodigieuse, for prodigious it really is, as well may be inferred from the fact that a complete set of band instruments can be comfortably stowed away in its bell. It lay for several days at the custom house awaiting adequate arrangements for safe transport to Mr. Fisher's store at 6 4th Avenue. The instrument was eventually taken out of its case and safely deposited on an unusually large padded truck. And as it passed through the streets, attracted the attention of the thronging crowds, many members of which, as if fascinated by the sight of such a Herculean contrivance, followed it to its future home. By the time the store was reached, as many as 3,000 spectators formed the interested crowd to witness the elaborate arrangements made for its safe handling. "My eye," remarked a street gamin, "isn't it a whopper? I guess that thing is for Pat Gilmore. He's the biggest band man in the States." "Well, there you're fooled, Jimmy," said another. "That's a going to Chicago for him to whoop up the World's Fair with." Mr. Fisher's store was besieged all day with curious spectators, and many wore the expressions of wonder at the enormous proportions of La Prodigieuse. End of extended quote. The article goes on to tell the hilarious story of how the very next morning a cat got stuck way down in the bell, and a young Carl Fisher employee had to dive in headfirst to retrieve the animal, only to get stuck himself. But don't miss the fact that once again, we hear mention of P.S. Gilmore in connection with this giant tuba. And there is also the suggestion that it might end up at the World's Fair in Chicago, which was originally scheduled for 1892. The article actually concluded by affirming the latter. Here's what it says. "Mr. Fisher states his intention to hold La Prodigieuse until after the World's Fair, when it will be placed on exhibition." Unquote. So, did it go to Chicago? And did Gilmore ever use the horn in his band? These questions bring us to the earliest known image of this wonderful instrument. Gilmore's Band of 100. The beloved Patrick Sarsfield Gilmore, it was said upon his death, quote, had a peculiar aptitude for large things, unquote. And while this was certainly hearkening back to his peace jubilees of 1869 and 1872, which were massive undertakings, the great impresario was also known to increase his famous band at times to 100 men. He did this in early 1891 and for 5 weeks that summer, and for his concerts at the newly built Madison Square Garden. But he also had plans to tour with a band composed of 100 first-class musicians in both 1892 and 1893. It was for one of those 2 years before his death that Gilmore had a poster made with a banner headline that proudly declared Gilmore's 100, the greatest band in the world. And in the illustration of the band below that, almost exactly in the middle of the back row, stands La Prodigieuse. On the bell, we can see a portion of what looks like Besson 1889, which the lithographer may have added to draw attention to this famous import from the Paris Exposition. And there appear to be 2 men in charge of the monster bass, and you need at least 2, one to hold it while the other plays. But the poster reveals almost nothing else that is relevant to dating it, except that there were also 4 helicans and 2 standard tubas in the band at that time, which squares with the number of bass players, 8, on the fall tour of 1892. Further, I have found no newspaper reports or images of the giant tuba appearing in concert with the band anywhere for either of those years. It may be that Gilmore was planning to feature the horn in his band at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, but the bandmaster's untimely death on September 24th, 1892, would have put an end to those plans. Carl Fischer, as noted above, spoke of taking La Prodigieuse to the World's Fair in Chicago, where he represented the instruments of F. Besson and Company, but there is no known record confirming that the monster bass had made the trip. The next time we get a glimpse of this imposing instrument, it is propped up in one of the tall, street-level windows at Fischer's New York store on 4th Avenue. The House of the Monster Bass. The earliest known report of the giant tuba on display in New York is in the February 8, 1891 edition of the Daily Continent, in an article that also happens to mention Gilmore and some of the unusual instruments that were featured in his band, such as the Antoniophone, Cerusophone, and Orpheon. But in discussing the Helicon tuba, which only a giant can attempt to play, the article said, it goes on to say, quote, "The largest instrument of the tuba variety ever seen in this country is La Prodigieuse, now on exhibition in this city," unquote. Whether this was in the window of Carl Fischer's store, it doesn't say, but most likely it was. What we know for sure is that by 1912, Fischer's establishment had become known as the House of the Monster Bass, which almost certainly means that La Prodigieuse imposingly towered above the pedestrians in the store window all those years. The earliest known image of this comes from 1896, by which time the store had expanded to 6 to 8 4th Avenue, although the artist wasn't really paying attention to the details of the tuba. A better rendering of the giant horn is seen in the window in 1901, or perhaps a bit later, when the store had grown to 6 to 10 4th Avenue. But in both cases, perhaps as a nod to its 1889 Paris Exposition glory days, there are instruments coming out of the massive bell. Was the tuba ever played during those years? We simply don't know. But in 1911, it was bumped from its storied New York perch by the arrival of an even larger tuba. Twin baby brothers arrive. Actually, it was the delivery of 2 colossal tubas that sent La Prodigieuse packing. According to a German report from 1912, there were now, in America, 2 giant tubas in B-flat with 3 piston valves whose fabrication was ordered for a business with branches in New York and Chicago from Boland and Fuchs in Grasles, Bohemia. The article goes on to clarify that it was Carl Fischer who ordered these giants, and Riley remarks that the concept to use such a monster instrument and eye-catcher solely as an exhibit and advertisement within a business building is typical American, of course. The first of these twins remains with Carl Fischer in New York to this day and is affectionately known as Big Carl. The second presumably went to Chicago, but eventually fell into the hands of C.G. Kahn Limited, who had it destroyed with a sledgehammer in 1942 to recycle its metal as part of the war effort. The horns were identical and immense, being 7 feet 9 inches tall with a bell diameter of just over 40 inches and weighing well over 100 pounds. But they were not fully functional tubas, as the valves were fake and the slides did not move. But my goodness, Big Carl must have looked even more imposing in the Carl Fischer store window, the House of the Monster Bass indeed. And what became of La Prodigieuse? Big Brother moves to Boston. It just so happened that around the same time that Big Carl and his twin brother were scheduled to arrive in America, Carl Fischer established a Boston branch. By early 1911, the store had expanded to new quarters, and La Prodigieuse was there to celebrate the grand opening. Here's the heart of that report. In line with its constant policy of progress and advancement, the well-known New York music house of Carl Fischer has recently removed its Boston branch to numbers 380 to 382 Boylston Street, in the heart of that city's most active business section. The monster bass shown in the picture is well known to many musicians throughout the United States who have seen it as originally displayed in the Carl Fischer windows at 48 to 52 Cooper Square, New York. Many amusing stories are told as to the wonder and excitement which this enormous instrument caused when it was first exhibited. Since then, this mighty bass has done much to attract attention to the Carl Fischer music establishment, and the story of its enormous size has been carried into every nook and corner of the United States. That it has now been transferred to Boston augurs well for the future of the New England branch. In New York, to a certain extent, it has stood as a symbol of the enormous business in whose windows it was exhibited, typifying the progress, development, and size the establishment had grown to in recent years. Now, that's quite a tribute, but it is curious that the writer used the word enormous no less than 3 times. He apparently had not yet seen Big Carl. Before moving on, though, it should be noted that in the 1911 photo that we can see, for the first time, the bell engravings that matches what is on the tuba today, which says Besson & Company, London, England, Carl Fischer, U.S. Agent, New York. But that almost certainly was not there originally when the instrument was built, as the lithograph from the early 1890s suggests. Besides, Carl Fischer's interest in the giant tuba appears to have come after it was built and put on display in Paris, so the current engraving was likely added by Fischer at some point after he purchased the instrument and brought it to America, so sometime between late 1889 and 1911. What was exciting to learn about La Prodigieuse from the years it resided at Carl Fischer of Boston is that it wasn't merely kept on display to entice people into the store. It actually traveled around town at times, and it got played. For example, in 1928, it was, and I quote, perched in solitary splendor on a 5-ton truck, unquote, and driven to the governor's mansion to serenade his family, although it doesn't say why. There is also a classic photo from 1929 where 3 women who were perhaps Carl Fischer employees were attempting to play the monster bass with one young lady serving as a kind of human mute, stuffing herself down into the bell. And in September 1945, the horn was strapped to the back of an army jeep and played as part of the local victory parade celebrating the end of World War II. But the most life-changing outing for La Prodigieuse came in late 1948, when the Carl Fischer store was paid a visit by members of the Harvard University Band. At the age of 59, the historic tuba was finally going off to college. Oops, joining the Harvard Band. On December 3rd, 1948, the Harvard Band, the Crocodillos, the Cliff Riffs, and the Hungry Five, which was a little German band made up of Harvard bandies, they all performed at the Drum Beats and Song concert in Boston's Symphony Hall. Proceeds were to go to Radcliffe College's 70th anniversary fund. In reporting on the concert the next day, the Boston Globe shared that, and I quote, "In the middle of a shindig of the kind that only a Harvard man could conceive, a couple of stalwart fellows lugged onto the stage a horn of such prodigious size," there's our word again, "that even Wagner would have been taken aback." Concerning the 7-foot tuba, it went on to explain that, and I quote, "One man played it, or played at it. He produced a few grunts and groans out of which convulsed a capacity audience," unquote, and that's all we're told. But it's the first time La Prodigieuse was connected with the Harvard Band. Now, it may very well be that the player of the giant tuba that night was part of the Hungry Five, as a photograph taken sometime between 1948 and 1950 shows it with that group. But the details of that night are unclear. What we know for sure is that from that point on, the historic horn is only mentioned in connection with the Harvard Band. For example, in 1950, for the halftime show during the Army game, which was to involve numerous short solos, and I quote now, William J. Reinhardt, class of 47, will come up from New York and may play the world's largest tuba in one solo, unquote. And in 1953, at the band's spring concert at Symphony Hall, quote, the world's biggest bass drum and the huge tuba will be added attractions, unquote. And the references go on over the years, but always in connection with the Harvard Band, not Carl Fisher, the original owner. In 1954, we find the first known mention that the band had accidentally bought the historic horn. The October 15th edition of the Harvard Crimson wrongly called it the band's gigantic sousaphone, but then added, quote, no one is sure just when it was purchased, but it seems clear that some enterprising bandsman picked it up for a mere $100 when it was unintentionally put on an inventory sale. And this is pretty close to the story that has been passed down over the years. Apparently, members of the band went to Carl Fisher in late 1948 to rent the tuba for use at the Radcliffe fundraising concert. But the clerk goofed and gave them a sales slip instead of a rental form. Numerous alums from as far back as the 1950s told me that they saw that sales slip, as did the longtime band director Tom Everett. As one alum speculated, and I quote, the band used that sales slip to claim that we had a right to keep the tuba. Sounds kind of crazy and ethically questionable, but keep it they did, unquote. And this brings us back to the photo of the Hungry Five. The leader of that group, Albert Moore, class of 1950, known to many as Boise, was also a student conductor of the Harvard Band during his time there. After being connected with his daughter, I told her what I knew so far about the giant tuba and asked if she thought her dad might have been involved in bringing it to Harvard. And she quickly remarked, and I quote, it would not surprise me in the least to find out that my father permanently borrowed the leased tuba. He was that kind of guy, unquote. So who knows? College life can be hard. The massive horn has spent most of its time at Harvard quietly leaning in a corner of the band room. But in a lighthearted Boston Globe feature from 1956, it was claimed that the tuba is played at Harvard football games, although the article went on to clarify that public appearances of the tuba are not frequent. For one thing, there isn't room in the instrument truck for both the monstrous horn and the enormous drum, the latter of which joined the band in 1927 and is featured on the band's logo to this day. The article added, when the tuba does travel, it is under constant guard by Harvard vigilantes. In the spring of 1958, it did travel all the way to Chicago for a special concert to benefit the Chicago Harvard Club Scholarship Fund. But on September 29th, 1958, we almost lost La Prodigieuse. At that time, the band room was in the basement of the Harvard Varsity Club, and a 2-alarm fire broke out in the building just after midnight. Later that day, the Harvard Crimson reported that, luckily, an assistant football coach who lived in the building discovered the fire and hailed the firemen, and before long, many students showed up and began pulling instruments from the burning building, including their beloved big drum and giant tuba, which is what you see being done in this photo, the tuba being pulled. These prized possessions would live to see another day. Starting in the 1970s, the giant tuba settled into a rhythm of being played every 5 years at the reunion concerts for the band's anniversary. The band, by the way, was founded in 1919 as a student-run organization. So this usually involved a world-class tubist, and on 5 different occasions between 1973 and 1994, the late Sam Pilafian of Empire Brass fame was the guest artist. When he first saw the monstrous tuba, he was mesmerized, but eventually was able to pull music out of it better than anyone else. However, as Sam knew full well, the Harvard years had not been kind to La Prodigieuse. One report from 1982, when the historic horn was featured at the New England Tuba Festival held at the Berklee College of Music, it stated that, quote, "Big tuba unfortunately looks a little tired. It's rather badly dented and could certainly use a good polishing," unquote. Restoration to the rescue. Not too many years after that, Marlo Segal, class of 52, a longtime board member of the Harvard Band Foundation, began pushing to get their giant tuba restored. He was relentless in his quest, and finally, by late 2018, a plan for restoring this amazing instrument was in place. This would have it looking spectacular and playing better than it had in years, and just in time for the band's 100th anniversary. But the details about its glorious restoration will have to wait until part 2. Stay tuned. End of article. Now, to read about that restoration, I interviewed Steve Dillon, the owner of Dillon Music, who was contracted by Michael Ruderman to do the restoration work, and Matt Walters, who was the actual tuba tech. He's actually affectionately known as the Tuba Whisperer. So he's the one that led the team that restored that tuba to its original glory. So you can read about that in the subsequent edition of the ITEA Journal, but I'll post a few pictures here so you can see the work that was done. And then the tuba was returned to the Harvard band room. This time, though, thankfully, it was put in a protective case, all trimmed in Harvard crimson. And I had the chance to visit it just a couple of weeks ago. So this is a picture with myself on the left and Michael Ruderman on the right, who have been so gracious all through this process of giving me access to information that he had, as well as the opportunity to visit the horn in its native environment there in the Harvard band room. So long live the Harvard tuba, la prodigieuse. That's the story. Who knows what the story will include in the next 100 years or so. Thanks for listening. Bye.